I'll begin by recapping, because I think the best way into this is to recapitulate the distinction I made last week between bounded posthumanism and unbounded posthumanism, and to think about exactly what bounds bounded posthumanism, and also what the underlying assumptions are even in so-called unbounded posthumanism, and where and at what point they might kind of fray or become problematic. And that's kind of where some of the recent texts are kind of situated, almost in a sense, having written the book, I'm actually unpicking it in places, and in a sense seeing what happens when you kind of break your own toys, which is it was one of my more irritating habits as a child. Somebody gave me a plastic helicopter. I usually take it apart, but unlike Wittgenstein, I wasn't so great at putting them back together again, which is probably going to be the leitmotif for tonight. Okay, so to recap, the kind of definition of the abstract definition of the post-human I discussed last week, the Disconnection Thesis, says some kind of fairly minimal things about what constitutes a kind of future post-human. That is roughly the ability of something that's artificially created in some way. And as I said, it could be some kind of cyborg, it could be some kind of artificial life form, whatever, to detach itself from the human system of ends that I call the wide human, the kind of total assemblage of human kind of cultural and technological and biological systems. Okay, so what I emphasized, I guess, was the abstraction of that description. It kind of leaves open exactly what the futurist post-human might be. It provides, if you like, just a minimal characterization. But allowing for that minimal characterization, that minimal description, there are ways we could conceive of, if you like, constraining the space of post-human possibility that I talked about. And Martin nicely likened post-human possibility space to, if you like, the phase space of all possible kind of post-human histories, if you like, branching out from the present. And the point is, we don't know from our position necessarily what belongs to that possibility space. It's a big X. But there might be kind of ways we can, if you like, constrain or limit the possibilities a priori, and that's where we get to the idea of bounded posthumanism. The idea, for example, that there might be central constraints on any kind of subjectivity that any post-human entity would have to satisfy. For example, it might need to be some kind of Kantian apperceptive subject able to apply language-bound concepts, able to think itself as the same throughout all its experiences, as Kant argued that the transcendental subject must do. It's analytically identical. When I think as a transcendental subject, I all I know is that I am that same self-identical being. I don't know what I am necessarily. It's a purely formal designation, but it's the condition under which experience can be unitary and accessible to understanding for Kant and for post-Kantian philosophers who kind of follow Kant. But you know, that's a very, again, is a very abstract characterization of a subject, and it's not obvious that it has to apply to the human, as a number of contemporary thinkers from Ray Brassier to Reza Negrestani have argued. So that might give us a kind of bound to posthuman possibility. If the posthuman has to be some kind of subject as we understand it within the sort of post-Kantian tradition, and I guess gesturing to Borna, who knows this stuff much better than me, that I guess that would apply necessarily to sort of Hegelian ways of understanding the subject, say as kind of located in social space, for example. Okay, then the looser, less constrained posthumanism I called unbounded posthumanism, which sacrifices even this kind of abstract constraint. In the book, in Posthuman Life, I dealt with this by, as I explained last week, developing a very minimal conception of the agent, which I kind of drew mainly from philosophy of biology, as a complex self-maintaining system, roughly speaking, or what some call autopoietic system. The thinking being that would describe anything that we might want to think of as a living entity, even if it was a kind of synthetic entity of some kind, something that can sustain its own existence, sustain the various processes that constitute it, by adapting to its external environment in various ways, whether it's by seeking food, seeking resources, seeking out energy, cooperating with other systems. So the thinking was that provides a more minimal characterization of agency, and obviously the underlying ontological assumption here is that whatever disconnects, whatever the disconnection thesis applies to, it has to be an agent of some kind if it's not to be empirically trivial, if it's not to have, in a sense, lose any purchase on reality. Okay, so that's kind of the space, the conceptual space established in the book. Following the book and having discussed this stuff with a number of thinkers, from Pete Wolfendale to Reza to Scott Bakker, who I think I mentioned last week. Scott's excellent science fiction writer, but also a philosopher. I advise anyone to check out his novel Neuropath, which is a kind of really dark techno thriller about a kind of crazy neuroscientist who starts experimenting on people. Although it's not for those with weak stomachs, I should add. But Scott has an idea which is kind of parallel to my idea of dark phenomenology. Did I mention dark phenomenology last week? Yeah, maybe not. Well, dark phenomenology is simply is a kind of critical tool. It's, there's a tradition in philosophical thought, particularly from Descartes onwards, of assuming that the subject, the thinking being, whatever that may be, has some kind of privileged access to its own mental processes, its own mental life. And obviously that in Descartes, that's expressed by the idea that the subject, the cogito, knows its thoughts, knows its ideas better than it knows the external world. And then the problem is, classically, if you start from this position, is how do you deduce the existence or nature of the external world, just starting with your thoughts. So roughly, Descartes argued that I may seem to be sitting in my study writing this text, sitting by the fire, but of course an evil demon could be deceiving me, or I could be lodged in the matrix in some kind of simulation. But the idea is, at least as long as I stick to a purely phenomenological language describing what seems to be happening to me, I can't go wrong, because in a sense my consciousness has a direct privileged access to its own experiences, its own nature. So dark phenomenology is a way of, if you like, unpicking that assumption, and it uses various arguments, some of them empirical, some of them not, to argue that it's possible for there to be conscious experiences that, while we have those experiences, having those experiences does not put us in an epistemically ideal situation to say what they are, to say what they like. And one example I use in the essay that developed that idea, Nature's Dark Domain, is that if you just think about very fine-grained distinctions in sound or pitch or color, one can often detect these discriminations. You can actually detect very finely graded musical pitches without actually being able to memorize them or recognize them on a later occasion. So it seems that our ability to discriminate within an experience exceeds our memory capacity, our conceptual capacity. So it may be that there are, in a sense, very fine gradations of consciousness that we're actually not in a position to really conceptualize adequately, even though we have them. And a more a priori approach to establishing that would be to look at various accounts of the philosophy of time in thinkers like Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, who argue that time is, if you like, our experience of time is not a series of discrete moments, but a continuous flow. And what I argue in that paper is, if it's a continuous flow, then it's infinitely complex, it's infinitely nested, and thus far exceeds our capacity to actually conceptualize or analyze it. So there are reasons to think that both empirical, the kind of thing the kind of evidence you get from psychophysical accounts of pitch discrimination, from accounts of change blindness, cases where one shows, say, two scenes to a person, to a subject, where one scene has had certain objects removed or exchanged, and they're unable to see the difference. To accounts within, if you like, a kind of deconstructive account of phenomenology that suggests that we have good reason to think that consciousness actually exceeds the nature of consciousness, and the nature of our mental life eludes our subjective grasp, that we are in a sense alien to ourselves. And Scott Bakker looks at approaches this similarly in his philosophical output, arguing for what he calls the blind brain. He argues that there's no reason to think brains are well equipped for understanding themselves, that they're evolved to solve external and social environments. Brains aren't equipped to solve brains. So there's every reason to think that our subjective experience is actually a cartoon of our mental life, not a reliable representation of it. And the German neuroscientist and philosopher Thomas Metzinger, cognitive scientist, I guess, has argued for a similar position, which he calls auto-epistemic closure, the idea that cognitive systems are not generally well equipped to model themselves with any precision, because if for no other reason than it's computationally extremely expensive to do so. You know, you in a sense have to replicate ramifying layers of complexity when actually all you want to be doing is avoiding being eaten by that tiger or falling into that hole. You know, it's just not very useful to have a very precise account of one's own mental life when a cartoon would do just as well, or what Bakker calls a heuristic. So the upshot of both dark phenomenology and Bakker's blind brain and Metzinger's auto-epistemic closure is that our sense of our own mental life, our sense of being subjects able to reflect on our own nature, is to some extent fraught with fallibility. And that is important for me in the book and in subsequent work, because I argue that if that's right, then you know our grasp of subjectivity, of the nature of mentality, is at least from a first person point of view, is actually much thinner than we realize, and doesn't give us a good basis for inferring what is necessarily the case for perhaps more exotic forms of life, or even other forms of non-human animal life. You know what, you know, so okay, so I'm trying to remember how I got to dark phenomenology. The point is, both dark phenomenology and some of the arguments I was developing in relation to Brandom as well, I think give us reason to be wary of bounded posthumanism, because we're just not, as reflective subjects, in a position to have privileged knowledge, not only of our own minds, but minds that don't actually exist or might be completely alien to us, like, I don't know, some really exotic post-human entity like a matryoshka brain, an artificial brain that surrounds a whole star made out of swarms of computational matter. I mean, what's it like to be a matryoshka brain? I mean, you know, how could we, assuming such things are possible, how could we possibly know, just generalizing from our own experience? So if that's right, then it's quite possible that there are kind of areas of post-human possibility space are really fracking weird, you know, and so weird that we're not in a position to understand them. We're certainly we're not in a position to figure out what they might be like from our armchairs in a kind of typical kind of philosopher's fashion. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, it might seem to leave us where the book left off, which is, you know, let's work with a minimal notion of agency, you know, where we can make certain assumptions that are so minimal that they have to apply to any agent, like all agents would have to be kind of autopoietic or self-maintaining systems of processes that kind of keep themselves, like you know, like cats or amoebas or whatever, that keep themselves going by you know, taking in nutrition, exporting, shitting, hunting, mating, whatever. And you know, that's actually, from the point of view of doing post-human bioethics, particularly, that's quite a nice assumption to work for. You can do quite a lot with that, in the sense that you can at least you can kind of run sort of philosophical simulations of how kind of post-human entities might have to adapt to certain environments, like fast changing technological environments. But you can push the hermeneutics of suspicion, if you like, further here. There are, I mentioned Matryoshka brains, and you might infer from this that there are agents, or I should say agents in quotes, or conceivable hypothetical agents that are so weird that actually even that minimal kind of schema doesn't apply. One, in a sense, more formal way of kind of demonstrating that is using the idea of what I call a hyperagent or a hyperplastic entity. And that's already developed in the book. And it comes out of the robot ethicist Steve Omohundro's work. Omohundro asks us to imagine a robot that's capable of kind of modifying its own code. And it asks us, well, suppose that robot has certain goals, like, to use Nick Bostrom's example, suppose it likes making paper clips. That's kind of its categorical goal in life. That's why it kind of lives to make paper clips. Or it could be some other goal. It could be counting blades of grass, or terminating people, like in the Terminator. That's kind of what gets it out of bed in the morning. So if that's its kind of categorical aim in life, Omohundro argues, then it would be rational for this creature to ensure that its goals don't change, because in a sense, this is its value. This is its chief value in life. And if something has categorical value in that way, you don't want to change it. You want to stick to what gives your life meaning. So he argues that such a being would want to clamp its kind of circuits, clamp its value circuits, if you like, to make sure that it wouldn't, if you like, deviate from the goal of making paper clips or counting blades of grass. Just as just as if you're a human being, I don't like the idea that I might become somebody for whom doing philosophy isn't any longer important. So if I was in that fortunate position, I might want to clamp myself to always doing philosophy, always valuing philosophy rather than, I don't know, watching Netflix. The problem, I argue, with that is that that you're attributing a kind of capacity, a very significant capacity to this system. That is the capacity to arbitrarily change any aspect of its own body, its own functioning. And the problem with that is that it's not clear how, at the level of its functional components or its functional states, it would actually map those functional states onto the values it wanted to keep. And one way of appreciating that is to go via a very standard idea in modern philosophy of mind that comes out of thinkers like Donald Davidson, but I guess also Sellers, and that's the idea of a kind of anti-reductionist materialism. So the basic idea here is that, yeah, the everything that kind of counts towards making your mind what it is physical. The brain is physical. Your thoughts, your beliefs are all individual physical states of your body, but it doesn't follow that we can simply reduce psychology to physics or neuroscience, because the two kinds of languages are, as Davidson argues, incommensurable. Physics and our folk psychological understanding of ourselves through notions like belief and desire are just, they work on according to different rules. For example, our folk psychological understanding imposes certain idea requirements of rational coherence upon a thinker, which don't apply at the physical level. So that the upshot of that is that you can't, there's no bridging theory between psychology and physics, or psychology and neuroscience, even though all individual physical states are, all individual psychological states like beliefs and desires are physical states. There are no laws linking physics and psychology. There are no, it's what Davidson calls anomalous. Or he calls this position anomalous monism. But the upshot is that of this then of anti-reductionist materialism, which I think is one of the most common kinds of materialism in modern philosophy, probably in continental as well as analytic philosophy, is that you can't, just by taking an arbitrary state of the brain or state of the body, deduce what value that contributes to, or what belief that is, or anything like that, even though what beliefs, values, etc. you have depends on how you're physically constituted. But that's a very weak dependence relationship. It doesn't give you that kind of detailed, fine-grained knowledge of how to translate from the neurophysiological level, the physical level, to the psychological level. And that constitutes a problem for a hyperplastic entity, because a hyperplastic entity would be working at the physical or functional level. It would be making tweaks in its code or in its functional structure. And if it can't deduce from that functional structure which values it's actually preserving or changing, or which beliefs it's deleting or creating, then clearly having the framework of belief, desire, psychology, or value, or all the spiritual nice stuff that we like, is of no use to it at all. So such beings, if they were to exist, just wouldn't be using the kind of anthropocentric framework that Omohundro and I think various other bioethicists assume would apply to such entities. We can't, in a sense, extend our model of our mental life to a being with the kind of competence to alter its own functional structure in a radical way. Not merely plastic. I mean, we're plastic in the sense that we can learn, we can change in the light of experience, but we're not able to. For example, if I have a morbid fear of milk, I can't tweak a particular circuit in my head to stop having that fear. I go to a cognitive behavioral therapist or another shrink. It's a much less exact process. But a hyperplastic, in the sense you imagine, would be able to make that tweak. The problem is that the kind of we wouldn't be able to understand what the hyperplastic is doing in terms of intentions or beliefs or desires or values. That language, that set of heuristics, to quote Scott Bakker, would not be applicable to something with that sort of ability to modify its own substrate. So I think, now obviously we don't know how far our capacity to modify ourselves and tweak ourselves can extend. This is an abstract thought experiment. But what it's designed to show is that if you imagine, if you like, an arbitrarily great capacity, then a lot of the assumptions about agency and subjectivity that we apply unreflectively to ourselves wouldn't apply in this situation. We no longer really have a language, a psychological language, for talking about such entities. And that's worrying for a number of reasons. It's worrying in terms of, if one wants to do both post-human bioethics and think about the ethics of possible post-human life forms, because there seems to be a kind of large blind spot looming there. And it's also worrying even for the very minimal system that I set up in post-human life, because it's not clear whether it makes sense to talk about a hyperplastic entity as somehow autopoietic or self-maintaining. What exactly is, such a being arguably would be arbitrarily changeable and protean. There would be nothing, it would have no kind of, it would be able to adapt ideally to any environment. It would have no kind of fixed body plan. It would have no fixed cognitive architecture. Almost nothing about it would be beyond revision. So notions of autopoiesis seem to just collapse here. And if that's right, it seems we've got a bit of a hole in the whole theory that I fairly painstakingly set up in the book. It kind of, the bottom falls out of it, because if you no longer have a set of agency constraints, then what is the disconnection thesis about? And that's the point at which we get to the more recent stuff, where I'm I'm thinking particularly about the biomorphism essay, where I'm trying to find ways of thinking about the post-human that take into account the slipperiness and uncertainty that I've identified in our notions of agency, that perhaps we don't really, we know even less than we thought we knew what an agent is, and hence what the subject matter of the theory that I'm trying to explain to you is, what it's, I mean, one of the consequences of the dark phenomenology thesis is that phenomenology doesn't tell you what phenomenology is, but one of the consequences of the various thought experiments and arguments I've been rehearsing with you is that we don't really know what posthumanism is actually a theory, if it's a theory at all, is actually about. It sort of becomes empirically, if you like, untethered, and in a sense even more abstract and than it already was. So in the biomorph essay, which I'm going to, once I've talked about that, I'm going to stop and just open it up, because I don't want to go on as long as I did last week. In the biomorph essay, I'm trying to find a language, a way of thinking about posthumanism which takes into account that extreme indeterminacy that I've just described. And one way of thinking about that is to start off with the idea of embodiment. On the one hand, I argue, it seems that embodiment is absolutely crucial for, in a sense, beginning to think about the posthuman, because what is the posthuman other than a kind of disturbance in the force, as it were, which affects our understanding of what our bodies are or could be. So just here, I'm not talking about the future, I'm just talking about the conditions under which we live, our sense that our immersion in technology, our practical everyday engagement with a massive technological system is in some sense making problematic who we are, what we understand as life, as agency, as desire, whatever. Okay, so that's kind of naive starting point, that in some sense posthumanism is about the various problems that our current technological, ecological situations create for our sense of ourselves as embodied subjects, human subjects, animal subjects, whatever. So the body seems to be essential for the posthuman, just as I guess at an aesthetic level, because we're starting from a kind of basic experience of estrangement and uncertainty about our embodiment, which can then be conveyed in popular culture through the image of the cyborg, whatever. On the other hand, if you follow through the train of thought that I was just developing, it's very unclear what we mean by a body, just as it's unclear what we mean by an agent. That at least there's some kind of suspicion that maybe those concepts might not travel as well as we think they will. So there's a kind of tug of war between wanting to kind of keep the body for posthumanism and wanting to kind of subtract it, to use terms that philosophers like Alain Badiou, I think also Ray Brassier have used. By subtraction, I mean kind of what Beckett does in some of his prose and plays, kind of reduce life to its absolute minimum, you know, and see in a sense how we can understand it. And philosophical subtraction is a bit like that. You know, when Kant sort of reduces the subject to the bare I think, he's kind of doing that according to Badiou. I'm probably misreading Badiou shamefully here, but you know. So there's a kind of tug of war between subtraction and embodiment, maybe we could try. And how do you resolve that? Well, if you get rid of if you jump the body completely, it seems to me that you haven't really got anything that I'm not sure whether you've got anything identifiable as a post-humanist account. You could call it other things. You call it inhumanist. You might call it any number of things. But at least just empirically looking at the literature that we call post-humanist, there is a kind of focus on the body at some level, which is essential. But if we do, if we think of the body in purely metaphysical terms, in terms of or in terms of a kind of ontology of the body, like the kind of autopoietic idea of the body I mentioned earlier, or perhaps a phenomenology of the body as a kind of lived subjectivity, or using, for example, Rosie Braidotti's idea of Zoe as kind of unbounded life, and you could go on. The danger is that we may be generalizing illegitimately from a purely human self-understanding of what life is or what subjectivity is. So there's a kind of philosophical dilemma, I think, and that's how the Biomorph paper begins, by kind of looking at that tension. And one way to kind of explore that, I argue, is well, one way to, if you like, mediate that tension. I don't think it eliminates it. I think it's an experimental way of kind of trying to work through it. That's the most I can say. Is not to throw away some sort of model of the body completely, but not to work with a kind of philosophical idea of the body. That is an idea that draws on some sort of invariance of embodiment, because it seems to me that if we're thinking, at least with I guess one of the virtues of if there is a virtue to speculative posthumanism is not so much that it provides us a way of thinking about the far future, as much as it just uses the far future to challenge a lot of our assumptions about what we understand about ideas like personhood, embodiment, and agency. You know, you don't have to think of it as futurist thinking. So what I propose is in a sense is to throw away the map or throw away the compass provided by phenomenology or vitalism or various other accounts of life, and to work with openly, if you like, artificial or if you like, artistic or artificial representations of embodiment, to be explicit about the fact that that actually we don't know what a body is or what it can do. So we have to work with models, we have to work with representations or artifacts of various kinds. And these could be aesthetic artifacts, they could be plastic artifacts, they could be literary artifacts, they could be scientific artifacts, perhaps, like various ways of, like CT scans or something like that. And just look at, if you like, the range of representations of the body we have, and then experiment with them, play with the constraints, see where they can go. And that may involve playing with, in a sense, our own bodies, or to cite J.G. Ballard, from whom I take the kind of idea of the biomorph, to play with our own pathologies or our own desires, to self-modify in experimental ways. So the upshot of that, in a sense, is that we lose a sort of naivety about the body or about agency, but at the price of, if you like, shifting posthumanism from a kind of philosophical, epistemological or ontological account of the posthuman, the kind I was setting out originally in the Disconnection Thesis, to a much more experimental and playful exploration of different models of life, different models of embodiment, which need not be bound together by a single theory or single ontology. And that's why towards the end of this essay, I look at, if you like, three avatars of the biomorph: Hans Bellmer's dolls, his mannequins, which in a sense look at the body as a kind of functional, in a sense break down the body into a set of functional components that can be modified and extended, and which in a sense play with ideas of desire and sexuality through this artificial mediator, the doll. J.G. Ballard's Crash, which I think is a fascinating text, because on the one hand it presents us with bodies for sure, but the kind of codes which define those bodies are no longer the codes which define, I guess, what you call a kind of Oedipal sexuality, or an Oedipal, or a kind of sexuality or a desire that's oriented towards life, towards reproduction, towards raising families, towards self-maintaining, and is in a sense far more abstract and perverse. You know, obviously, if you know Crash, it's about people who get their kicks crashing cars on the M4 in England in the original book. Somewhere on the outskirts of Toronto, I think, in Cronenberg's movie. But what interested me about that book was, if you like, the way Ballard makes these events, these crashes, these mutilations meaningful. And he does it, I argue, through ultimately a kind of empty signifier. I mean, it's very tempting to read. I'm not a Lacanian, and I don't really work much with psychoanalysis, but it's very tempting to read Crash in terms of Lacanian psychoanalysis as, if you like, oriented around a kind of around an emptiness, a kind of a black hole, or what you might call the real, which is, in a sense, never cognized, never understood. You know, in a sense, all the characters in Crash are yearning for the ultimate conceptual auto-disaster, which will solve everything. But we know from the very beginning of the book that ultimate conceptual auto-disaster can never occur, because the main protagonist misses his target. He's trying to crash into Elizabeth Taylor near the London airport flyover, and hits a school bus instead, or you know. So in the sense that it short circuits its own intelligibility in a absolutely brilliant and fascinating way, and presents us instead a kind of dispersal of bodies and objects and concatenations of objects and bodies, which is bound together purely by this empty metaphor of the crash, which in a sense is meaningless, you know, but it meaningless in a very kind of structured and rigorous way. So that would be another example of the biomorph. And then I finish with Gary Shipley's book, Werewolf, which I argue is experimental novel, which I argue takes that process of decoupling of meaning and bodies even further. Okay, so brief word about how that might, and this is speculative, it might relate to some of the kind of experimental texts that I gave you. Ocean Terminus, which was kind of my first attempt at that kind of writing for the 9th Berlin Biennale edition of Dismag, and a kind of experimental short novel novella, I'm not sure, which I'm working on currently. I'm sort of hoping to finish it in the next month or two. I'm appallingly slow. Provisionally titled Snuff Memory, which also has a similar kind of perverse approach to embodiment, as I guess if you've read it, any the extract, you'll realize. But in a sense, I mean, you know, it's hard to kind of second guess one's own aesthetic decisions. I mean, I happen to like that this kind of open sort of montage style, but in terms of my philosophical work, I think in various ways it may be exploring how we think about how we kind of capture shreds of narrative and shreds of meaning in a world where embodiment is kind of and identity and subjectivity are kind of radically open to question, and in a sense they're in a state of crisis, or on the cusp of crisis, perhaps a crisis that we can predict, perhaps a crisis that we can't predict. So that's all I want to, and I realize I've gone on just as long as I had last week, having said I won't, but I'll open the floor at this point, and just for questions or discussion points, or any interjections you want to make.
Hi there, this is Yuri. I actually had
Hi, Yuri.
Hey. Great, there we are.
Hi.
How's everybody doing? First of all, thank you again for, doing part 2 with us, and everything. And I really appreciate, your time and commitment to discussing this with us. But I was really interested in, even doing your reading, I started to think about sort of like these internet communities that exist, and, how to some degree, there's people that are bonding through internet, but, their perceptions and like the way that they choose their, like, what they desire is, I think, starting to be radically different than what we typically base our attractions on. Like, they're not necessarily physical in this sense, or because it could be like an avatar that somebody's attracted to. And there's things like Second Life and a bunch of other like sort of things where people, like, I guess still adhere to a certain thing, but like, I guess there's communities that form attraction based on like what kind of games people play, or like how they play them, and like sort of the relationships that form that are like long distance relationships through the internet, and like sort of like the different like sort of things they take on, because these relationships oftentimes may not be like of a reproductive nature in the sense that we know, even though they might still fill our need for desire and being desired, and fulfill our sexual fantasy, and in that sense, there's still, I guess, groups out there that are starting to get what they need that we typically use as like a strictly or acquired through a biological way, you know, starting to get it like very different, you know, in a different way. And in that sense are also starting to, I guess, affect like their gene pool, like, you know, who survives, you know, and moves on and what values they carry on, which are now also imbued with this like need for this technological medium, like of the internet or computer, and just in general for all this like silicone technology, whatever, to exist, you know?
Yeah, so they're kind of making memes instead of babies.
Right.
Crudely. Yeah.
Yeah, we could
Yeah,
say
no,
that.
I completely get that, and I think it's really interesting. And I think if there's I'm sort of hoping that the kind of twist that I've given to the theory recently, where it's in a sense no longer about the far future, it's about experimenting now, gives us a way, perhaps might potentially give us a way of thinking about that phenomenon. I mean, you know, it could be online role playing, you know, whether erotic or non-erotic. As you say, it could be, I don't know, various affinity groups, political groups. I guess, I mean, I don't know much about incel culture, for example, but,
right.
You know, but I guess it's hard to, you know, that's, I mean, you know, there've always been young men who are sort of sexually frustrated, but there haven't always been incels in the sense of, you know, ascribing that meaning and significance to sexual frustration, I guess. So, I mean,
do you think there's like a bit of the post-human could be already like, you know, how you were saying that we have trouble might have trouble identifying, you know, what like the emergence of post or like the beginning of it. I was wondering, like, you know, some of these behaviors can be so extreme that we start to categorize them, you know, as needing intercession or somehow being like a medical issue, or, you know, for us, a medical issue.
Yeah.
Could there be?
Yeah. Sorry sorry, I interrupted you. I think, yeah, I mean, I use the example of the Biomorph essay of Ben Yeager's book, Amygdala Tropolis, which is basically about a young man who exists purely online. He buys his own parents' house from them and kind of just moves into their bedroom and never leaves. He just orders in and spends the whole day watching, you know, various forms of clickbait, you know, on the internet. You know, most of it really nasty stuff, you know, and that's kind of what the novel is about. And it kind of draws on this idea, this Japanese phenomenon of the hikikomori. I'm probably not pronouncing it right, of these young men who kind of withdraw from physical social interaction. I don't know whether it's mainly young men as opposed to women, but you could, you know, I mean, in the original theory in post-human life, that wouldn't be plausibly a kind of case of post-human sort of transcendence or disconnection. I mean, that you know, they're still ordering takeaways, for God's sake. They still depend on the whole economic, agricultural, whatever system to work. You know, so they're not like robots shooting, you know, forming communities on the far side of the moon or whatever. But once you kind of make the theory more permissive, and for the reasons I've put, you know, following through the arguments I was rehearsing earlier, then it becomes possible to, in a sense, be more permissive about what might constitute the post-human. In a sense, your only guide then is a kind of aesthetic sense of estrangement or difference. And of course, that's, you know, one of the problems with that, many problems with the theory. One of them is that obviously that's doesn't sound very philosophical or theoretical. And so, but as a way of, if you like, experimenting with the idea of the post-human, it could be potentially fruitful, particularly if you kind of think of it in terms of a, some kind of aesthetic practice or process.
Yeah, I think I'm really, on board with that. And, as I think a lot of people here come from like some sort of artistic background. And I think creating desire while working within constraints, is something that we're really all kind of familiar with, except our mediums might be a little bit limited. But I think this, it really helps with the imagination at the very least, this sort of thought. And
well, if that's all it does, that's nice. I mean, as I said, it's a lot of this theoretical stuff came out of a kind of sense of being troubled by some of the assumptions, in a sense whether the arguments I've been developing actually kind of boomerang back and undermine a lot of the assumptions I was wedded to in the book. But I'm kind of open to seeing where that opening up takes me for now.
I definitely think it's still a system that's moving forward, even if there is some sort of feedback and undermining. I think like what's going on though is still leading towards that post-human.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think the difference between what I called critical and speculative post-humanism becomes much more blurred.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're both we're all in a sense trying to think about how various aspects of the contemporary world or post-contemporary world or whatever are impacting on our sense of ourselves as agents and subjects.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Yuri. I think Martin also has a question.
Hi, Martin.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Okay. What you've laid out in these two talks is, I think, really powerfully executed. Attempt to figure out what's possible beyond the human. Now that was a pretty nonsense statement, but to focus it in a little bit more precisely, I want to talk about bounded versus unbounded posthumanism and its relationship to autopoiesis, vitalism. And I'm wondering whether, when considering and possibly rejecting, if I can use the word that I use all the time, emergence, which is a catch-all category for all the different kinds of theories of self-organization that have come around the pike. And I'm wondering if by rejecting that category in order to insist on an unbounded posthumanism, or to keep alive the notion of unbounded posthumanism, that you've really started thinking about what's post-life, not what's post-human. So let's put it this way. You know the concept of an event cone, where you have two, in a sense, I don't know what you call them, fulcrums, inverted with each other. And in the moment where they meet at the end of the kind of cone triangle, that's the now.
Yeah.
Okay? Anything that occurs within the lower cone could possibly be a catalyst to a future event that occurs in the upper cone. whereas on either side of the cones is what's called the elsewhere zone.
Yeah, so that's from relativity theory.
And this is,
yeah,
I think, what you mean by, well, did you use the word strange? No, I've lost what you used in your book.
Might have, I'd probably use various,
you know, like the amorphous,
weird, whatever. Yeah,
yeah, the weird. Okay, that was the word that you used, the weird. Now, there was a book that got published in the middle of World War II, and that book was a really powerful statement by the physicist Erwin Schrödinger, who wrote a book called What is Life? Mm. And what he attributed to life was this notion of order emerging spontaneously. And the model that he uses is from what was available at that time, which was a kind of entropy which doesn't move in the direction of disorder, but which moves in the direction of greater orderliness, which is negentropy. Yeah. So that was like the first attempt to formalize a theory of life. And what I find interesting about autopoiesis is that it's used not only to talk about steady state systems, even at the cellular level, and to talk about cognition as occurring even at that level. But it became to be applied to artificial intelligence. And so I'm wondering, to separate theories of emergence from the post-human possibility, and we're keeping in mind weirdness, is that post-human or is that post-life? And therefore, why refer to things in the realm of the weird as post-human?
Well,
because they occur in the weird, they're not coming out of what was human. It's not.
Well, I mean, I
think that's enough.
I can give you a kind of naive response, and I mean, it's the best I can do at this stage. I mean, I think it really, it's probably an area where, ideally I ought to collaborate, because, there are lots of areas, for example, like, machine intelligence, computer science, where I'm pretty sketchy. I just kind of, have an amateur grasp at best, and obviously the same goes for far from equilibrium thermodynamics, and so. But here's a kind of naive response, going back to the idea of the hyperagent, which was one of the, if you like, the avatars of the weird post-human. Yeah. It's probably the avatar. You can, especially if you liken it to Lovecraft's idea of the Shoggoth, this protean lump that slurps around and can assume any shape. Well, one way of kind of making a claim for why the hyperplastic could be in some sense post-human is to argue that, after all, the hyperplastic could be reached by increments from the merely plastic, that is, from creatures like us. That is, by progressively enhancing the capacity of that creature to modify itself.
I would agree with that, but the question is,
so the idea why should extending agency, in a sense, so the hyperplastic is reached by extending incrementally extending the agency of the plastic creature. So a naive response would be, well, how can you, why should you not regard as, in some sense, an agent, something you achieve by extending the agency of another agent to, if you like, some sort of asymptotic limit? You know, we don't know what the limit of plasticity is, but, you know, suppose it's extremely permissive, then you might think at some point you get something like a hyperplastic, something that actually couldn't be interpreted in the terms that we interpret kind of regular life forms or ourselves.
So then how do you separate that by making the concept of emergence and all the different versions of
using, yeah, I don't know if I'm using the I'm very fuzzy about what emergence is, because there are different concepts of emergence.
Well, let's just
say, I mean, I think the most emergence that I kind of assume in the book is no, I might be wrong, but I think the most emergence is something like weak emergence, that there could be, that there, you know, so a weakly emergent system is one that can't be sort of analytically predicted, but has to be simulated in order to understand its dynamics. So that makes no, it's not an ontological account of emergence. I guess it's an epistemological account of emergence. And then obviously there are stronger accounts of, you know, and there are totally batshit accounts of emergence, like you get in quantum Meillassoux, for example. You know, so you got weak emergence at one end and Meillassoux batshit crazy emergence at the other end, and then some kind of great gradations in between. And I certainly don't need kind of batshit crazy emergence, and I'm wondering whether we might get by with weak emergence, but maybe not. I mean, maybe you need something stronger, but that can still be put on a kind of firm metaphysical footing. And that's a really interesting thought, and it's interesting also whether thinking in terms of whether one could repair some of the constraints that I've been supposedly upsetting.
In other words, can you separate
or somebody else could, because somebody's smarter than me, because I'm not sure how to do that.
So the question is, how can you separate life from the various theories of emergence that have come down the pike, both within philosophy, but also within, you know, the specific mechanisms, laws of emergence from the sciences?
Well, ultimately, probably with difficulty, if at all. I mean, I think, as I argued in earlier, that the kind of key category here is the category of agent. And you can certainly develop a kind of idea of agency from within the sort of, you know, the understanding of emergent systems that you've been describing. And I guess autopoiesis would be an example of that.
Yeah, that would be a good example.
You know, because where you've got a set of processes whose such that the way those processes combine together perpetuates that ensemble of processes. So naive example would be respiration. Obviously, is essential for other bodily functions, such as fluid transfer or maintaining the health cellular structure. So you've got this meshing of processes which keep each other going, and that seems to be a kind of very, and it can be modeled in various ways, but it seems a powerful way of thinking about how, without having to posit any crazy kind of emergence, some, complex, self-individuated things arise from the slime, the primordial slime, you know. And obviously it's up to the scientist to figure out the details of that, but you know, that works for me as a kind of naive kind of ontological account of emergence, which doesn't kind of, it doesn't require any of the kind of you know, it doesn't require anything like I don't know, you know, some accounts, I guess there are some accounts of phenomenal consciousness emerging from things that lack phenomenal consciousness, which seem much stronger. You know, so those philosophers who argue that consciousness must be radically emergent from certain kinds of non-conscious material system, I guess it doesn't need anything as exotic as that. So we're still working within something that I guess would be scientifically tractable and tractable in modeling terms as well.
Yeah, I think that would be my point. I would really like to see you work that out. I mean, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be interesting to do. And as I said, I fully admit that the account in the book is pretty hand wavy. I just, you know, it was enough to get me from chapter 5 to chapter 8. But I freely admit it could have been much more rigorous, and I could have actually looked much more widely at the literature. But it kind of, you know, it worked the way I needed it.
But the scaffold is there. There's no question to me. And I mean,
one thing that occurs to me, and here, you know, I'm really hitting the limits of my kind of scientific knowledge, is some of the theory underlying kind of predictive processing models of mind, but I'm not. It's not so much predictive processing. It's the idea. It's the way that links to the idea of the way the agent is embedded within its environment. Carl Friston's work. I've kind of forgotten the name of the theory. It just eludes me. But I mean that draws on statistical mechanics, but you know, you know, so I mean, I guess, I mean, one way of thinking about the organism or a cognitive system that way is as a series of state transitions or Markov blankets, which interact in various ways between the internal milieu of an organism, the various kind of mediators, the perceptions and actions of the organism and the environment, you know, and that provides a very high-level general account of what, in a sense, any kind of cognitive system has to do. Which, so you can then think of cognition really as arising out of this much more kind of physics, thermodynamics-based.
Yeah, I mean, Varela actually talks about, you know, phase space, and talks about Brownian phasing of cognition.
Yeah. I mean, my naive kind of response to that is, yeah, but actually a hyperplastic probably wouldn't have a Markov blanket because it could be anything. Because, you know, so I'm not sure that, I mean, you know, which in scientific terms is completely useless. We're in no position to buy a theory of cognition, and Carl Friston would, I'm sure, happily kind of junk any such kind of speculation. But luckily, I'm not actually, you know, that's not what I'm trying to do. You know, but there probably is at least an essay or two to be developed here, looking at contemporary complexity science as a way of you know, and I mean, I suppose I should mention the kind of work that Reza Negrestani is doing in Intelligence of Spirit, where he's thinking about emergent computation as looking at, in a sense, the way inferentially adept creatures could emerge through social interactions between creatures that initially don't have that inferential competence, but merely have a sort of bare sentient ability to kind of track their movements. And again, that's something I need to look at, and I'm, you know, but I don't feel, you know, intellectually equipped to deal with it in the kind of detail that it merits just now. You know, I mean, that's kind of really a future research program as far as I'm concerned.
Well, let me stop you here. Thank you for that really considered response. I really appreciate it. I mean,
no, thanks for the
you
question.
probably know I have a question about dark phenomenology, but I want to step back and let other people participate.
Well, maybe time for that later. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I think Felice has a question, right? Yes.
All right, I'll throw something out there. You know, in researching with Adrian, my colleague on here, we did a research project based on Metropolis and the figure of Maria, the robot in the film. And there was a good article we read that considered this idea of reproduction versus basically replication. And that, you know, that is in fact the agency that Maria has, as she's affiliated with now a body that can replicate, not traditionally reproduce as in human. So just thinking about the idea of virility versus, say, vitality, how does that relate to your notion of the subtractive body?
Wow. That's a really interesting question. I mean, when I did write about Maria in a short article that was just looking at kind of film and TV depictions of the posthuman. And the thing that struck me with Maria actually is probably, you know, maybe this is not immediately relevant to your question, so I'll try and curl back if I can, was the way that actually she is kind of positioned as a sort of, even though she's a machine, she's actually treated pretty much as a sexual object, and as a pretty abject one at that. I mean, she's completely, after all, completely under completely corporate control. And when she, you know, eventually, I think she's destroyed, burnt to death, or something. So she's so in a sense, she has this potential that you've identified for replication that's kind of never realized. I guess it's incipient, but because of the kind of, because she doesn't disconnect, it remains incipient. It remains kind of within webs of both corporate and patriarchal domination, I guess. But yeah. So that said, suppose the machine mention Maria kind of in an alternative version of Metropolis kind of establishes the means for her own reproduction, you know, the material means. You know, it's a kind of a different kind of proletarian revolt, proletarian revolution. Then in a sense, as you say, we're no longer talking about sexual reproduction or desire, but a kind of replicative capacity, which is no longer, which is no longer sort of presumably no longer within any kind of familial structures or any kind of social structures that we would identify, but there is still something something like life going on, some kind of replication, perhaps variation, mutation, selection even. So, you know, after all, Darwinian constraints can be applied to algorithms, so why not, you know, think of this as an extended form of life? I don't know if this is a sort of very good answer to your question. I'm more probably riffing off it rather than answering it, but maybe you want to come back.
I just think the notion of linking virility to your concept of the subtractive body, I think, is interesting, because it sort of goes against a kind of anthro notion, right? Anthro.
Okay.
Conform.
So,
yeah.
Right. So so one way of, if you like, subtracting from the body is in a sense to junk notions of virility. I mean, that's really interesting, and there are kind of ways you could go with that. For example, you know, you could argue, for example, that there are certain forms of sexuality, such as sadomasochism, for example, which are inherently artificial because they don't depend on any kind of conventional sexual choice or sexual focus. They are constructed and they're more mediated. So perhaps that's another way of, if you like, exploring the same phenomenon.
It makes me think of Marquis de Sade's writings a little bit.
Yeah, which are replicative to a massive degree. Yeah. And obviously something like Ballard's Crash, you know, where, you know, there are kind of, there's something like an erotic investment in these events, but they're not aimed at anything like reproduction. They're again, it's purely it's about the whole, it's about replicating series and conjunctions of meetings between objects and bodies and places. So it's, in a sense, it's kind of a purely cyborgian, if you like, symbolic space with no reference to anything like, you know, even though there are conventional sex acts, the kind of system within which those take place is not kind of what you think of as Oedipal sexuality. So yeah, I'm that's really interesting. I mean, maybe you could say, you could send me the link to the text you mentioned. Sometimes I'd be quite interested to follow that up.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
It would be also great if we could have the link to the article that you referenced, Maria, when you're talking about film and cinema as well, too.
Oh yeah, I can share that. I think it's on my academia account, but there's quite a lot of stuff on there. So I just to make it easier for you, yeah, I can certainly share that. Yeah, because it's in one of these heinously expensive handbooks, which really nobody in their right mind would actually buy. So yeah, for sure.
If I could just follow up on that a little bit with, you know, I guess replicating versus cloning, you know, how does that play into this as well too? At all?
Okay. Well, I mean, it isn't cloning at least a kind of replication insofar as it involves replicating a creature with the same or some kind of cellular, some kind of biological system with the same genetic structure as a source, without kind of conventional sexual reproduction without meiosis or so I'm not sure that it's not a form of replication. I mean, it's just an instance of replication, isn't it? I mean, obviously replication can take many other forms other than cloning.
Right. I guess I'm curious about how that looks in post-human society as well too.
I don't talk that much. I mean, there are lots of kind of interesting ethical issues about cloning and genetic engineering, which are the kind of which have given rise to something of an academic cottage industry within bioethics, which I don't really touch on that much. For example, whether parents are entitled to, for example, whether parents are entitled to intervene in the genetic code of their children, whether to whether to enhance them or even to deprive them of certain senses. So maybe deaf parents, might want to have deaf children because they see that as their culture, and whether that's kind of ethically problematic or not. I mean, I guess crudely replication at some level seems to be necessary when we're thinking about any kind of agent, any kind of system, insofar as it has to replicate it. It has to reproduce its conditions of life. It has to replicate itself or creatures like it, in order certainly for something like a Darwinian process of evolution to work. So, I mean, obviously Darwinian evolution doesn't require sexual reproduction, but it requires reproduction of some kind. At a more, if you like, transcendental level, you might argue that replication in the form of what Derrida calls iteration or iterability is essential to any kind of articulation whatsoever. So if you think about how language works, languages require repeatable or iterable elements as well as other structures like recursion. But basically you need phonemes, morphemes, whatever, types that are recognizable in different contexts as the same. So, when I use a word like the or if, you can recognize it as a, if you like, as a token of the type of that English word. And Derrida argues that, any kind of any system of science, any system in which sense and even life is possible requires that very simple iterative process. So, I mean, you might talk about cellular replication or the various processes, sort of processes which function in any living creature that involves some kind of reproduction of re-identifiable units. So you could argue that's a sort of, maybe if you're trying to develop a sort of very abstract theory of the post-human agency, that some notion of iteration, iterability would be essential. And not just when, certainly it's essential if you're talking about signs and symbols. You need iteration and recursion, certainly to have anything like a language. By recursion, I mean the embedding of structures within themselves, in grammatical, in terms of grammatical structures. But for that iteration is a kind of separate requirement because you need re-identifiable components. So I guess where I'm going with this is that maybe iteration is essential to a kind of formal ontology of any sense-making, agent-like system whatsoever.
I mean, I also think the translation, I wonder if how that change or mutates, how, you know, each time that it's replicated as well too, and how that affects what things may be. Because,
do you mean translation in linguistic terms?
I guess translation of, for me, more of a visual translation, I would, or even you know, I guess, yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, just going back to Derrida, because I think Derrida, I used to write a lot about Derrida, but and I'm not a Derridian, but I think there are some kind of really, you know, the bits of Derrida I like best are the really abstract bits in some of the earlier work. And, you know, the idea that he plays with iterability is that although iterability requires identity, it also requires difference, because each time something's repeated, it's happening in a different context, in a different situation. And therefore, whatever is re-identifiable has to be re-identifiable under change, under shifting circumstances. And therefore, Derrida uses that to argue that, in a sense, what is iterable is never a kind of Platonic sort of idea. It's never a kind of essence which is always the same. It's actually something that resists reduction to either a singular one-off event or a repeatable ideal form, which then allows you to think of processes like translation, or perhaps what, really going beyond my competence here, what philosophers like Simondor call transduction, as involving the production, both something, a form of repetition that's also bound up with difference. And obviously that's kind of very crucial in Gilles Deleuze's work as well, because for him, repetition fundamentally is always producing, is always differentiating. It's never kind of ultimately not representable as a, in terms of discrete and perfectly re-identifiable units, although Martin might want to pick me up there. I'm probably, but so I mean, there are, I guess I'm kind of, I admit I'm working on a rather abstract plane here, but I think you can take this idea of repetition, replication, and obviously you can associate it with various forms of sexual reproduction, or indeed virility, or whatever, but you can also think of it as a kind of component, conceptual component of a sort of formal ontology of life or sense making or meaning or agency.
Thank you.
I probably petered out here, so somebody better come
No,
in.
there was definitely way more to think of than I thought you know was possible. So thank you.
Thank you. Borna, I think you said you have a question.
Fine.
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, David. Sorry, my internet cut out earlier, so I was dropped.
Totally.
Zoom call. You know, technology is getting its revenge on me. But thank you for the talk. I have maybe a couple of one less serious question, and then maybe a more annoying and semi-serious question. So I'll ask the less serious question first. And so I'm wondering if you've seen, there's this new HBO TV show called Raised by Wolves. It's the Ridley Scott.
I haven't. I've seen the trailer, which looked really interesting. And I
Yes.
know Jeff Vandermeer, who I've got a lot of time for, obviously really liked it. So, yeah.
Yes,
That's all I know about it. Really, it looks good.
I think it really, because you've been speaking about replication, reproduction, life, biomorphism, and so on. I only saw the first episode the other night, and it really draws on these themes in interesting ways. I'm not going to ruin it or anything, but I'm sure you would find it fascinating. And it's because of course so repetition, replication also makes me think of Blade Runner, of course, and the replicants. But I suppose in that kind of science fiction world, we're dealing with androids that are androids that are kind of made to look like human beings. They are, I mean, the whole point of Blade Runner, as we all know, I hope, is that you can't really tell androids or the replicants and human beings apart. So that kind of divide becomes, in a sense, meaningless. But I suppose what you're talking about in this talk is a very different form of agency that doesn't necessarily have to take or be constrained by the shapes or by the anthropomorphic shape of the human, I suppose. And I find this interesting, which leads me to my second, maybe perhaps a bit more annoying, but also maybe a bit serious question, which is you mentioned that, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I was taking notes as you were speaking. You mentioned during your talk that that part of this work that you're doing now, kind of building on your original thesis of the disconnection thesis, you are now, you think that speculative posthumanism, or its biomorphic variant, however you want to call it, problematizes and challenges our sort of preconceived notions of embodiment and agency and so on. I mean, I find this fascinating, of course, but I'm just wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more about that aspect of it, because as far as I know, the notion of human subjectivity isn't, there's no consensus on what that even means. Even in German idealist circles, people are still, even in Hegel studies, people are arguing over each other because there's no real agreed upon definition. So I'm wondering, if you can maybe speak a little bit more about how you see your work, because at one point you said you think, it's not so much that we're kind of positing future forms of post-human life. It's more that, and again, correct me if I got this wrong, but at one point you said it's because we're positing this kind of futuricity of post-human life that we can then kind of question our preconceived notions of agency and embodiment and so on. And I think you're probably, so I think that's probably true in some sense, but I would like to hear a bit more about it, if that's okay.
Yeah. I don't know how satisfying I can be. And I think I'm sure I'm aware, of course, that there are very different conceptions of what subjectivity is. As you say, even within the broadly continental German idealist tradition, and I'm sure that I haven't been faithful to all those nuances, and I guess it would be very useful for me to know, in a sense, what nuances I'm missing potentially, as somebody in a sense who doesn't have a kind of a scholarly grasp of that material. So today, I talked about a range of ways of thinking about the subject. So you've got the, I mentioned the Kantian subject, the kind of formal unity of experience, of unity of apperception. And of course, you can then look, as Kant does and as his successors do, in a sense of what the conditions of possibility are for that unity, which is in a sense, the whole point of pursuing transcendental philosophy. And that can take different forms. It could be, some kind of sociolinguistic situated subjectivity, or it could be something. It could involve looking at something like Merleau-Ponty's embodied subject as a kind of version of the being in the world that derives from Heidegger. So that the subject, as in a sense, correlative with a kind of experiential world. And then obviously we were talking about these kind of rather minimal subjects, like these kind of basic autopoietic units. So, you can, I'm kind of aware that obviously you can multiply subjects. There's no one subject philosophically, and a sophisticated accountless material needs to be aware of the pluralities of ways there are for thinking about subjectivity. And I'm completely open to the idea that we've touched on a bit on sexuality and gender, but we haven't talked about psychoanalytic accounts of subjectivity. I mentioned Lacan, I think, briefly, and that's actually that's kind of one area where I'm not a Lacanian. I'm not deeply invested in psychoanalysis, but I am aware that correlative with the kind of biomorphic account is at least some notion of desire, because in a sense it requires, on the one hand, if posthumanism consists in the production and the experimentation and production of biomorphs, of, in a sense, body variants, if you like, that implies some kind of desire. I realize I'm going dark, and I'm just going to turn the light on. Sorry about this. Yeah, I was kind of fading on you. And that's actually what I was beginning to do in that piece for identities, which I thought I'd mentioned, but obviously didn't, subtractives in aphelia. So that on the one hand, you have subtraction, experimentation, the kind of epistemological and experimental aspects of posthumanism, but those seem to imply some kind of desire to be other, to experiment or pursue the other, even though that desire can't actually be linked to any particular satisfaction conditions, because it, in a sense, it can only discover what it wants by producing it. It can't sort of preempt it within the sort of rather austere epistemological framework I've developed. So I mean, but obviously there's an obvious analogy there between the kind of say with Lacan's reading of Kant, as in a sense, and here I guess I'm following thinkers like Zizek or Alenka Zupanich, who argue that actually what Kant does is not, in a sense, produce a kind of rationalist ethics, but a theory of desire as lacking a sort of ground in any kind of theory of the good, any kind of conception of positive conception of the good, precisely because the kind of conditions which Kant sets for moral thought are in a sense impossible. I mean, I'm rehashing their arguments, but I think there is an interesting kind of line to explore there, and I think I'd want to do more of that. If for no other reason than it allows us to talk about various kind of contemporary cultural phenomena from different forms of affiliation, sexuality, or whatever, you know. So I think it's kind of so it's not an annoying question at all, Borna. It's a really necessary one, but I'm not sure if I've answered it satisfactorily.
No, it's fine. You know, you brought up psychoanalysis, and of course, you know, that made me think of, because last time you were speaking about, you know, this idea of the post-human being a totally disconnected alien kind of other that has no relation, or in a sense is disconnected from, you know, the kind of wider human, as you said. And of course, psychoanalysis isn't so much about the alienated other, but it's about the alienated other within each of us, the unconscious, right?
Yeah.
And that's also kind of fascinating. It's in a both in a kind of intersubjective way, but also in terms of our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of our own desires, or what we think we know about ourselves, and so on. So so it can really, I suppose, it can complicate for the better. It can complicate the idea of subjectivity.
I think so. I mean, since what I'm trying to think about here is not so much the idea of an alien subjectivity, but as you say, the alienation implied within the very post-humanist project of trying to think through this stuff. I mean, why are we doing it? What is, in a sense, animating this speculative project? So right. It's actually very similar to what you do, you know, to your you know, your very, you know, your very clear account of kind of psychoanalytic alienation, if you like. You know, there's a lot to be said for not reinventing the wheel here and actually looking at these kind of models, which something I'm prone to do. I'm probably out of laziness as much as anything, but you know, looking at these other available models of subjectivity and seeing what desire and seeing what can be done with them. But I mean, I kind of feel it's very, you know, it's still very tentative at this stage. You know, I'm not sure what's going to work, if anything.
That's right. And just one more question really, and then I'll wrap it up from my end. But so if we're sticking with the psychoanalytic aspect a little bit, I'm wondering if you have considered, maybe you have, I don't know, considered Freud's uncanny, or the you know, the notion of the uncanny valley, of course, you know, because it is a form of weirdness, and it's a very unsettling and upsetting thing to kind of see, you know, something. It's I can't think of examples of it, but it unsettles our kind of comforting notions of what human beings ought to maybe be and look like and behave like.
Yeah.
And so the uncanny valley stuff is upsets all of that. And so there's also that aspect of as well. You know, there's an aesthetic, perceptive aspect of the kind of alienated other within us, which is interesting.
Yeah, I haven't used Freud's conception of the uncanny in my work, and I mean, perhaps I should. I mean, that's a really, I did shortly after my book came out. I wrote a piece for Ida Connolly and Gary Shipley's book on serial killing and philosophy, where I kind of look at the serial killer as something, or as, you know, particularly the psychopathic serial killer in fiction, like, you know, Hannibal, or as well as in fact as a kind of alien, you know, because for various reasons they don't respond empathically in the way that most of us do, or if they seem to do so, they do so in a purely manipulative way. And I suggested that, in a sense, part of the seduction of that kind of figure is precisely that it implies the way that our human nature is kind of dependent on a nature which is fundamentally inhuman and to some extent out of our control. You know, which I guess is both seductive and terrifying. But it would be interesting, you know, it would be interesting maybe to introduce, and obviously to the notion of the uncanny has been used to, as you say, particularly in robotics, to describe robots which to some extent are humanoid and resemble us, but precisely because they resemble us and aren't us, disturb us and kind of, if you like, short circuit our ordinary kind of empathic reading of their bodies. So, you know, certainly an interesting area to pursue. I just haven't, as I said, I've only pursued it really in that one regard.
Okay, so we have two more questions. One from Martin. Do you want to go ahead, Martin? And then last we can have Rodrigo to ask his question.
Yeah, I realize there are a few questions that have been coming up on the chat that I haven't responded to, but yeah, I'll go with Martin, and then.
Well, why don't we postpone my question to make sure everybody else gets a chance?
Yeah, so I've got, let's see. Okay, this is from, I'll probably mispronounce, Hoka Vembidi. I'll read it anyway. So, hello, David. Maybe my question's off topic, but I have problems discussing recursive intelligence with AI designers. Usually I tell them my problems with recursiveness text and their potential inside human intelligent operations. I need to have a clear insight of the dominant knowledge that social sciences that define what is intelligent and what is not, and the requirements of an intelligent entity. Okay. Having read that out, I'm not sure whether I can provide a satisfactory answer that an AI designer couldn't. I guess there's an issue about how you define intelligence in a way that's appropriate for artificial intelligence and artificial systems. And one of the things that theorists of robotics and in AI struggle with is providing a theory of intelligence which is abstract enough to embrace, for example, I don't know, maze running robots, search engines, various kinds of I don't know, evolutionary algorithm. I mean, the whole range, obviously, different. There are different kinds of algorithm, different kinds of learning and intelligence, even within, you know, the range of artificial intelligence. And you know, the challenge that presents is providing a kind of sufficiently abstract theory of intelligence. I do talk about that a bit in my book. I mean, I guess the most common one within AI is to think of intelligence as some kind of optimizing process. You know, wherever you have a system which has a number of different end states it could be in and has some more or less reliable way of finding the optimal ones. You know, it could be that where optimal could be contextually defined. It could be just solving a mathematical problem, for example, a traveling salesman problem or something like that. You know, so you know what I mean. Think about a search engine. The whole point of a search engine is you input some string of characters, and you want your search engine to find something, say, in the database which corresponds to that string. And there are various strategies with which it might do that. It could exhaustively run through the whole database, which could be very slow. There might be ways in which it can maybe cut short that process, make it less exacting. But they're all examples of intelligence in this sort of sense of optimization. I'm not sure if that's a particularly helpful answer, but I think if you look at some of the abstract work in computer science, oh, cheers, a cup of tea. Cheers. Some of the abstract work in computer science, it's mostly focused on finding abstract, often, you know, mathematical conceptions of what it is to optimize in the widest possible sense. So, you know, that might be of some help, or it might not.
Okay. So, should we continue or stop it?
Yeah, I'm happy to continue. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, Rodrigo and Martin, I know have questions. So.
You want me to go ahead?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Martin.
Okay. Well, I actually have one short question, and then let's go back to exploring what you really mean by dark phenomenology, which I think is a really powerful concept. You know, in Gravity's Rainbow, you have the early part of the detective story part of Gravity's Rainbow is trying to figure out what is the relationship between Tyrone Slothrop's sexual activities and the explosion of V2 rockets. And you have two men. One is a guy named Pointsman who tries to establish a cause-effect relationship between those two events. And you have someone named Roger Mexico who basically resorts to a probabilistic model of the relationship between Slothrop's sexual conquests and the explosion of V2 rockets on a grid of London, which is basically 576 squares, which is a perfectly symmetrical chessboard, 6 chessboards on a side. So I'm wondering whether what the difference is between that kind of epistemological problem that Pynchon poses for understanding the relationship between sex and destruction, and what's going on in Crash. So, and I'm wondering whether you knew Ballard was a Pynchon fan, or whether there's no relationship at all between these two interesting kinds of plot devices. So that's one question, and you know, and then the other question has to do with, you know, how do you construct a dark phenomenology given what's been going on in contemporary embodied cognitive science?
Wow. Okay, Ballard and Pynchon. Okay, it's a long time since I've read
Yeah, me too. So
Gravity's Rainbow. I mean, I read it during the extended period of unemployment, and it's kind of like it's practically the only way you can read something like that. But thanks to your summary, by the way, because you actually made far more sense of the plot than I ever managed. But I mean, I just remember laughing a lot and just being completely dazzled by the whole thing, and it also had a disastrous effect on my prose writing, because at the time I was trying to emulate Pynchon, and that's just kind of right, like a really bad idea, like, it's like, so, kind of poisoned creative writing for me for a while, I think. But okay, so in a sense, the question in a sense is whether perhaps there's a kind of different way of reading Crash, other than the kind of metaphoric, symbolic reading that I urge, where in a sense the crash is a sort of token of something like a Lacanian real, a kind of impossible object of satisfaction, which obviously is programmed to be impossible from the outset of the book.
Well, let me throw this out first.
Yeah.
In quantum mechanics, and in particularly the quantum electrodynamics of Richard Feynman, in mapping subatomic particle interactions, every event is simultaneously an act of creation and an act of destruction, so that you could read Feynman diagrams on any one of four sides, so that if you turn the diagram of an electron hitting a positron and forming an explosion which annihilates the both of them,
Yeah.
you could have a positron shaking apart into a pair of electrons.
Okay.
And so Pynchon is kind of playing off of this kind of reversible physics model of time and the problem of analyzing those events, that looking at one way it's an act of creation, looking at another way it's an act of destruction. And so with Crash, it's been too long since I read that. I'm one of those people that will, if something becomes really hot, I'll read it just so I can function in a cocktail party. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I haven't read it since. And so I'm just wondering whether that resonates with you at all. If not, let's just move on to something else. It just
I just think it's an interest, because I'm aware that my reading of Crash is very specific, and initially it came out of it's the only time I've ever used Lacan really in to do any work, but I just used him because it just seemed so obviously usable for that book, even though Ballard is not. I mean, Ballard's into psychoanalysis, but he wouldn't have had much time, I think, for Lacanian psychoanalysis and that very kind of abstract academic style. I mean, I know, so the other source I was using was Baudrillard's essay on Crash. And actually, I suppose Baudrillard is perhaps closer to the model you described, because he just describes the world of Crash as a sort of hyperfunctional system, which it extends beyond any kind of conventional sexual logic, and where, in a sense, destruction is as much a characteristic as creation of the system. It has no finality to it at all. As he said, it's hyperfunctional. It has these machinic components that work together to produce something that in a sense has no ultimate goal at all, which is kind of rather the way I kind of view technology anyway.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So I mean, I think that's an interesting. I mean, I think you know, this is really off the cuff, but it seems to me that you know, if you were kind of trying to develop Baudrillard's reading of Crash in the light of the kind of sort of scientific accounts that you describe, it might go something like that, and it might resemble the kind of metafictional processes that you're describing in Pynchon's.
Yeah, you know, I wrote a piece in '92 which talks about this and actually mentions.
Yeah, I should read it actually, Martin. I mean,
Lacan's real and the vacuum state.
Yeah.
I mean, it actually made that connection. So I'm you know, I'm definitely think there's these are complementary readings. Not to make a Heisenberg joke, but.
It would be probably interesting for me to follow up, simply because I've kind of been I've been kind of dining off this 2002 essay I wrote on Ballard ever since, just providing more succinct versions of the same thing, and I haven't really developed it in any substantive way. So it would be an interesting way of kind of throwing a spanner in the works and actually seeing how that could be.
Yeah.
You know, developed and warped and interesting ways.
So let me talk about dark phenomenology just for a second, and you can, you know, pick up and run with it or defer it for another conversation. But when we're talking about things like invisibility and indiscernibility, like Deleuzian zones, is that kind of what you're referring to when you're thinking about where these new kinds of logics or post-humanity might emerge beneath the threshold of the Kantian self-awareness?
Well, I think going back to dark phenomenology itself, it's not necessarily a kind of it's not necessarily only ascribed to posthumans. I mean, I argue that actually most of our phenomenology probably is dark, simply because, you know, that stuff's too complicated, you know, you know, and you should expect it to be dark for the reasons that Bakker lays out, that actually minds and the processes underlying consciousness are so complex and counterintuitive that, you know, it's very kind of extravagant to expect us to have some kind of adequate self-conception of them. You know, it's like, so, and what's interesting from that point of view is as an epistemological project is to simply locate those areas, whether it's in empirical studies of, you know, empirical studies of pattern recognition and memory, musical pitch recognition or whatever. You know, there's a whole load of empirical areas where, you know, it seems that, for example, our ability to kind of get out of the present, to remember and conceptualize what it is we've been experiencing is limited by certain memory constraints and stuff like that. So, you know, it doesn't have to be, you know, it's just part of this kind of post-Cartesian critique of privileged access, I suppose, that you find in Wittgenstein. And, you know, it's just a different way of, or Sellers, it's a different way of kind of looking at the same problem.
So you think I might be right when I'm trying to establish a resonance with, you know, the work that I've been doing on competing forms of time cognition in the jazz improvisation subject?
Yeah, because I mean, I think we were talking about this last week. I mean, my example was just the multiplicity of branching decisions that go into a jazz solo that we're both,
Right.
as practitioners, we're kind of aware of. And, the impossibility of subjectively reconstructing all the kind of ways you eventually got to that. I mean, the solo may be crap or it may be brilliant or somewhere in between, but the point is there are a whole series of different decisions that you make which you're not
aware of. Yeah.
Aware of. You're aware of the results, and you're kind of, and there may be certain junctures which are more, I mean, especially if you're a kind of, if you're not a particularly adept musician like me, that there are certain tunes where I kind of, I know there's going to be a chord change coming up, like I don't know, Miles Davis is so what. I know the change from D minor to E flat's coming up, but I've suddenly forgotten which bar I'm in, and I'm kind of listening out to see what the bass player does. So there are those moments which are obviously exquisitely kind of fraught with self-consciousness and terror. But when things are going well, usually you're soloing, you're not.
I'm well aware of the experience of panic.
Yeah. Okay. So there's some light phenomenology, and often it's kind of actually associated with it's rather like in Heidegger when the hammer breaks, with things not going smoothly. But when things are going smoothly, you're just in it. And there are lots of kind of, I mean, there's from and this better than me, there seems to be evidence there are lots of kind of, if you like, micro decisions, micro effects, which are giving rise to what you hear as a performance, which are lived and embodied, but not analyzable in terms of kind of standard kinds of feeling or they're radical. So I think Deleuze is probably helpful here, because they're radically singular affects, not re-identifiable kind of folk psychological dry goods.
I think I would like a bibliography from you at some point, or a help in dark phenomenology, because I should be reading this stuff, because I'm coming straight from the cognitive science.
Well, it's my term, so I mean, obviously, there's a fairly small, few, but I think there are lots of, if you look at, say, someone like Metzinger, I guess his idea of auto-epistemic closure is very similar, and I think some of Dennett's work, say in Consciousness Explained, is going in a very similar direction. I mean, basically, Dennett argues that our standard way of thinking about qualitative consciousness in terms of qualia, in terms of sensations, the normal kind of zoo, the phenomenal zoo, is just a kind of bad theory which gets us into trouble and gets us producing extravagant metaphysical fantasies like David Chalmers' theory of consciousness. So there are lots of different ways into this, or different ways of kind of looking at the same area. But it's from my, initially I was just, I was interested in the idea of how you naturalize phenomenology.
So is dark phenomenology your term?
Yeah.
It's great. It's a wonderful concept. It really is, and I don't want to take any more time. So thank you for that, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation.
And I'll respond to your email at greater length. I'm sorry.
No, there's no worries.
We'll talk next week.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.
Okay, so there's one more question, but also Borna wants to introduce the next class. So maybe, Rodrigo, you want to go ahead but summarize your question? Yeah.
Yeah, I can be quick.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, so on the flow of emergence, so the psychological states, subjectivity, emotions, as emergence of a biological system, you have that. And then we also have the desire, which is, or can be seen as a reward system, right? So we drive on rewards. And this in the neurophysiology of decision-making has been also being researched. So you can see the onset of decision making, right? So our biological systems are making decisions even before 2-3 seconds before we actually press a button or whatever. But during meditation, you break these systems. So the reward system, these networks in the brain get broken. They're not there. And I'm just thinking that meditation can be a way to tap into the biological system. So go over the emergence and the desires and tap into the biological system to maybe, create this post-humanistic window. And my question to you is then whether you have or do practice meditation, and if you have had a transcendental experience with the practice, and if you, maybe see it somehow as a window to follow up on these discussions.
That's really interesting, Rodri. I don't practice meditation currently. I did have a sort of encounter with a Buddhist group at university, and I did try out some meditation, but I never really took it very far. So we did things like the mindfulness of breathing, where you focus on your breath, and in order to or some other very fine-grained sensation in order to sort of arrest your thought processes and achieve a different state of consciousness. But I wasn't very good at it, and I'm probably I'm not one of life's joiners anyway. So kind of, I'm kind of interested. I find Buddhism really interesting, and but I've never really explored it. But I can see that. Yeah, I could see there may be a way in which meditation or other spiritual practices like yoga, can hack into the. Can hack the mind or the body in interesting ways, and in fact, music. Practicing music is a bit like that, because you're actually forcing your mind and your body to do very unnatural things, like play complicated passages on an instrument or whatever, through various kinds of learning practice. I guess I suppose that I'd say, I don't even know if I should admit this on Zoom, but I did once take LSD. I only took it once. I don't actually enjoy drugs really, recreationally, and it was absolutely terrifying. Not an experience. I just went with some friends to Cambridge and took a couple of tabs of acid on a nice summer's day on a croquet lawn, and you think that would be great, but I think playing croquet inspired deep paranoia in me because of the kind of the competitive gaming aspect, and that really led to a very bad trip. However, it was interesting to literally feel your mind come apart, and to be kind of overwhelmed with these indescribable sensations. And I remember at one point in the trip, I became obsessed with finding the nearest railway station, because if I found the nearest railway station, I could, if you like, situate myself into some kind of network, because it really was like all the kind of links with normality, stripped away, and just leaving this sort of storm of sensation. I mean, I suspect certain forms of really extreme mental illness are like that, but it was an interesting thing to experience. I just don't want to repeat it, so that's probably the nearest thing I've had to a transcendental experience, and it was really crap. It was really nasty, it was really terrifying. So I guess it would be nice to know if there are more benign ones to be had out there. I'm not sure. I'm sure there are. I'm just probably not the best candidate for them.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, David. This was such an amazing study group. Also, it was very generous of you to share your work, knowledge, and time with us.
Oh no, it's been a pleasure from start to finish. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been really helpful for me, because that I need to rethink a lot of these. As you're probably aware, there's a lot of stuff that I feel I need to rethink or reorientate, and it's been immensely helpful just to give me ideas to perhaps pursue, and do that. And it's just encouraging when people want to read your work. It's just nice to, so thank you for being so engaged and so into it. It's been really fun.